Hey guys, it's me Astrid, and today I wanted to talk to you about mounted orchids. A lot of you saw my mounting station and showed some interest in my mounted orchids, so I thought I would share how I like to mount orchids and give you a little kind of crash course on why we mount orchids and what's going on with that. So before we start, we have to understand that orchids are epiphytic, and what that means is that they grow on trees, but they're not parasitic. They're not harming their host tree in any way. The word epiphyte comes from Greek epi, meaning in addition to or on, and phyto, I think, meaning plant. So you can put those two together, upon another plant, and that's how many orchids grow. Now, some orchids are epiphytic, and some orchids are terrestrial or semi-terrestrial, meaning that they need to grow in the soil or in the ground. They have different kinds of roots and different kinds of needs. However, orchids all have their own similarities, but this Paphiopedilum will not be okay to mount. This Phalaenopsis will be okay to mount. Let's go through my collection and show a few orchids that we can mount and cannot mount. Orchids that we can't mount. Paphiopedilums. These orchids have fuzzy little roots that like to stay constantly and evenly moist. These grow along riverbanks, though some can be lithophytes growing on rocks or other kinds of epiphytes, but anything in the Cypripedium alliance, as far as I know, and that includes Paphiopedilums like this, and Phragmipediums, is not going to do well mounted. So if you see your lady slipper orchid, don't put her on a mount. Let her stand tall in a pot like this. Now let's talk about orchids that can be mounted. Cattleyas. Phalaenopsis. Bulbophyllum. Neophonetia, or Vanda alliance. Dendrobiums. Brassivola. Oncidium. Encyclia, and so many more. If you're not sure which orchid can or can't be mounted, you can always Google, is this plant epiphytic or is it terrestrial? And if it's an epiphyte, you can almost for sure mount just about anything. Now let's talk about the pros and cons of mounting orchids. There are a few cons I wanted to list first. One, they have a tendency to dry out quickly. This is because it's some thin layer of moss, and sometimes in the heat of summer you may have to water your mounted orchids twice a day. But that's not completely necessary in all climates and all environments. So always consider your own personal growing space and climate before you say yay or nay to mounting. Another con is that if you layer the sphagnum moss on your mount, if your moss is too thick, sometimes it can attract fungus gnats, which is just gross. Fungus gnats aren't really harmful, but they're really nasty and I just hate them. So that's another thing that annoys me a little bit about mounts. But if you have any potted plants in your house, you're probably gonna get some fungus gnats. There are so many huge pros about mounting that for me it outweighs the cons. One, you can never overwater these. This moss, for me, in winter dries out in about 3 days, and in summer is drying out in about a day. So if you're heavy-handed with watering, this is not going to be able to be overwatered. If it's in a pot, you might suffocate the roots. If it's on a mount, probably not. Another pro is that yes, indeed, orchids do grow this way in nature, so when they are growing on a tree, that's when they're the happiest. Also, it looks very pretty. There's a super wide range of ways you can do it. You can mount it on a pot, on a log, on a tree branch. You can make a branch with a bunch of different mounted orchids on it. You can make your mount as big or as small as you want. You can do so many things with mounts. And I also like it because they look a lot more natural. So, now that you've been introduced to mounts and a little bit about them, let's go look how to do the actual mounting process. So you ask, what things am I going to need to mount this orchid? Well, you need some clear string like fishing line or jewelry making string, and some scissors. Of course, you need wire and wire cutters. This wire is 12 gauge, and I thought I needed a heavy duty wire so my orchids wouldn't break it, but honestly, a thinner wire will work better and be a lot easier to cut. And if your wire's too thin, you can always double it over and twist it around and use it as like a double thickness from that thin wire, and it'll work just fine. Next, we're going to need some kind of a drill. This drill is one that I use for like doing acrylic manicures on myself, but it has a bunch of different bits that come in handy for doing other stuff like drilling holes in my pots and mounting my orchids, so I'm using this little cheapie. Of course, if you have a power tools at home, it's going to be a lot nicer, but you can get away with this. Then of course we need our orchid, bare rooted, and our mount that we're going to use. Today I have chosen some cork bark. I like cork bark because it's lightweight, it looks very natural, it's somewhat water resistant so it won't get too waterlogged, and you can get these basically at any pet store in the reptile section because people use this type of stuff for housing their reptiles, making a natural looking environment. And the great thing is that because it's meant for your pets, it's already sterilized. You can get all kinds of wood and stuff from outside, but I don't know how to tell you how to sterilize it, and you definitely want to make sure it's clean before you bring it around all your home plants, because you wouldn't want to make them sick by bringing in some icky pest-infested wood, right? So buying cork bark at the pet store or on Amazon is a great idea. As an aside, sphagnum moss can also be purchased in the reptile section. They use it to humidify a reptile and amphibian cages. So you can get those all in the same part of the pet store, and it's super convenient and really easy to find nowadays. Last but not least, I like to pre-wet my sphagnum moss for when I'm putting it on the mount, and you're just gonna get that sphagnum moss and put it on there. Now, I like the stuff that you can get from ZooMed. Again, in pet stores or on Amazon, but it's pretty good. Just make sure it's like the lighter colored sphagnum moss, because the darker colored sphagnum moss tends to be in smaller bits and a lot harder to use. But this one has relatively long strands, which make it a lot more practical for mounting purposes. Now that we know all the stuff we'll need, we can go ahead and get started. So come down here with me on the floor and I'm going to show you how to mount something up. All right, here we go. So down here I've got a mount. It's already prepared with a wire through it, so I already have a way of hanging it, and that's going to be awesome. We also have the lovely orchid. It's bare rooted, it's been cleaned, some of the dead roots are trimmed off. Right before mounting is a good time to kind of do some maintenance care, pulling off this sort of dead, dry stuff and making sure your orchid is in nice, pruned, clean condition. So at the base of the orchid, typically on a young orchid you get from the store, because most from the store are very young, or divisions from other orchids, but our lowest bulb is probably going to be the oldest bulb. And the bulb with the flower spikes tends to be the one that's going to release a new growth, at least in Oncidium. So if we look right here, we can see this new growth growing right there. So we don't want to crowd this. We're going to be careful when we place this orchid so that the orchid will be able to grow in an upward direction and look nice on the mount and also have enough room for its roots to be covered. Now, I am kind of on the fence because this orchid's going to look nice this time if I have it hanging up. However, if I put this orchid facing down like this, the flowers can hang down and this new growth is going to have plenty of room to come up here and spread out and fill this mount, and hopefully it will grow in this direction. Another option is that if I wanted to, I could kind of prop this up on some styrofoam, which I might go get, and I can have it hanging sort of at this angle. And I think that's going to be the best today. So when you're planning your mount, just be smart with your new growths and look at the direction of where the new growths are, and maybe look at some pictures of how an Oncidium or whatever type of orchid you're working with will grow in nature. Here's my styrofoam bits. We're going to use that in a minute. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take our string, which may be hard to see, but that's the point, isn't it? It's clear because we don't want people to see it. So this string we're going to wrap around here, and we're going to tie, and I leave a long tail on the string because we're going to use that later to tie off the other end. And I like to tie down quite a few knots so that this is really stable. And then what we're going to do is position the orchid. Maybe we're going to put a couple pieces of sphagnum moss down so the orchid has a little bit of a base. And because this is a moisture-loving orchid, putting a little bit of moss down first is going to be something that it will probably appreciate. Now, when we wrap this, we're going to wrap with the string in our hand so we have good control of it. So just wrap around and sort of pin down that sphagnum moss so it stays where we want it to stay.
Alright, I decided to speed things up because this will take a while, but here I'm making sure that the plant is going to hang nicely on the mount and look both visually appealing and be positioned in a way that's healthy for the plant. Let's get a wrapping. The first step after you lay down a little bit of sphagnum moss is to sturdy the roots. Wrap them so they're going to be stable while you add other sphagnum moss, and so that the plant is kind of not moving around while you're trying to layer sphagnum moss on. It can be a disaster. Here I'm propping that styrofoam in so the plant hangs at the angle I'd like it to hang at without stressing the roots. Now you can really dig that fishing line into the styrofoam to hold it super tight because it's not part of the plant, so it doesn't matter if it gets a little bit of excess pressure on it. Now I'm positioning the plant just a little more, and let's add that sphagnum moss. So you can see I'm putting it at just a very intermediately thick layer. Again, if it's too thick, you can kind of over soak the roots, and if it's too thin, it'll dry out too quickly. So you want to find that happy medium. After you secure that first base layer, then start wrapping again. I like to wrap the sphagnum moss a lot of times because I hate when little pieces of it dangle down, but as long as it's in place and not falling off ridiculously, you've done a good job. Alright, now I'm making sure that plant is secure again, and I'm adding extra sphagnum moss as I go. It's good to get your base layer, and then you add little pieces of sphagnum here and there to cover those open spots. There's another little open spot of roots. Now if this were a cattleya, I might leave those roots bare and open, but since it's an oncidium and since it's a water-loving plant, I'm going to make sure it has moisture, moisture, moisture. Add in some more. And now I'm checking the sturdiness of the plant. Is the plant wobbly or not?
So, I don't know if you can get a good view of this, but I just like to go between the pseudobulbs very carefully and fasten it down a few times that way so the plant is extra stable. Now, I have been paranoid in the past that kind of wrapping between the pseudobulbs is going to divide the plant, but I have not had any actual trouble with that. So I feel that this orchid, being at this point, is pretty sturdy. Like, I can kind of pick up the mount by picking up the orchid gently, so it's okay. And at this point you can see our new growth is pointed. You see that little baby new growth is pointed right so it can grow up this way, and eventually hopefully this plant is going to fill up this mount going out this way, and that'll be really nice looking. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip this over and we're going to go to the back. Remember, we left that tail there. So here I found my tail, and I'm going to cut my string, and I just am going to tie this off with several knots again, and tie it off nice and tight. You don't want that string to be flimsy or it might loosen the whole mount and be weird. Someday I might make a video for you showing how to mount a rootless orchid. I have mounted rootless orchids this year that were doing really bad, and when they went on the mount they started to do really, really well. So I might show you how to do that someday, but for now let's go back upstairs and I'll show you the finished product. Okay guys, ready for it? Here we go, ta-da! This is my mounted orchid. As you can see, even hanging an Oncidium upside down, it still looks really nice. These blooms are droopy and pendulous and beautiful. As you can see, there's the drippiness I was telling you guys about before, dripping down from the moss. But otherwise, what we have in our successful mount is an orchid that's oriented to grow properly. We have a good layer of sphagnum moss so we can keep our roots moist. We have the plant angled so that it's going to grow out in a way that will leave room for new growths. And we have a stable mount, so this orchid is not very wobbly on the mount, it's very secure. And with that recipe all filled out, you're going to have a happy, healthy mounted orchid. Eventually, and even not that long in the future, your orchid's going to start shooting out all those roots, you see? And eventually the roots will take over the whole mount. And that's your ideal situation, and that's what orchids naturally want to do. So, someday you're going to have a happy, healthy, specimen-sized mounted orchid, and it's going to be just wonderful. And it's because you followed these steps or something similar that works with your growing environment. Alright guys, let's show this off one more time. Here's my mounted orchid. Thank you so much for watching this, and happy growing. Have a good day. Bye.